Verb conjugation in French is the modification of a verb's form that expresses facts, repeated actions, and a list of actions. The present tense is one of the easiest tenses in French because it has a simple conjugation pattern with no progressive tenses. To conjugate verbs in the present, we have to understand how to identify French verbs, such as who is doing the action and when the action happens. For now, we'll focus on the conjugation of regular verbs in the present. Although French has irregular verbs too, those will be shown separately in the next video. So, regular French verbs always have an infinitive form that falls into three categories. Et, which are the most common, like parler, to speak, ir verbs like finir, to finish, and re verbs like attendre, to wait. These words are infinitives, the basic form of verbs without conjugation in any tense. The best way to recognize them is to see the time change in a sentence, which combines with the personal pronouns j'ai, tu, il, elle, on, nous, vous, il, elle. Let's begin with et verbs. The conjugation pattern for et verbs in the present goes as follows. We get the verb stem by dropping the ending from the infinitive. Then, we add the endings to the stem that correspond to the category of the verb. Since we're beginning with et verbs, let's use the verb parler, to speak. To conjugate parler in the present, we drop the endings, get the verb stems, and then add the endings that match the category. For j'ai, add et. For tu, add et. For il, elle, on, add et. For nous, add on. For vous, add et. For il, elle, add et. Je parle. Tu parles. Il, on parle. Nous parlons. Vous parlez. Il, parle. These are the endings for regular et verbs in the present in French. And as a note, because final consonants are silent, some conjugations have the same pronunciation, but different endings when written, like je parle, tu parles, il, on parle, and il, parle. Let's move on to ir verbs, like finir, to finish. The conjugation pattern for ir verbs in the present is similar, where we get the verb stems by dropping the endings and then adding the corresponding endings to the category of the verb. For ir verbs, the endings are I for j'ai and tu, I for il, on, ils sont for nous, c'est for vous, and is for il. J'ai fini. Tu finis. Il, ou finit. Nous finissons. Vous finissez. Ils, finissent. Again, because final consonants are silent, some conjugations have the same pronunciation, but different endings when written, like j'ai fini, tu finis, il, ou finit. Let's finish with re verbs, like attendre, to wait. The conjugation pattern for such verbs in the present is also similar, where we get the verb stems by dropping the endings and then adding the corresponding endings to the category of the verb. For these verbs, the endings are is for j'ai and tu, just the stem for il, on for nous, et for vous, and et for il. Considering the previous conjugations, some endings are simply borrowed from et verbs, like on, et, and et. J'attends. Tu attends. Il, on attend. Nous attendons. Vous attendez. Ils attendent. In this case, the conjugation for il, on is just a stem with no ending, and the pronoun j'ai has elision with attendre, because the pronoun begins with a vowel and the conjugation starts with a vowel. Once again, because final consonants are silent, some conjugations have the same pronunciation, but different endings when written, like j'attends, tu attends, il, on attend. At this point, you might be wondering how it is possible to distinguish the conjugations when they're said. In my first French video, I mentioned that subjects are never dropped when they're spoken with their conjugations, because the pronunciation of some will be the same, despite having different writings. This is the reason why French requires conjugations with the subjects, because without them, it would be impossible to tell who the subject is, due to the same pronunciation of some conjugations. In other words, to distinguish the difference between conjugations, always say the subject with the correct conjugation. In conclusion, this is how regular present verb conjugation works in French. The concept simply follows endings that correspond to each verb type, so it's made from stems plus endings. Once you memorize these patterns, you can conjugate many regular verbs correctly and speak French using short, simple everyday phrases like Tu parles anglais. Il aime le chocolat. Nous chantons ensemble. J'ai fini mes devoirs. Vous choisissez au film. Les enfants grandissent vite. J'entends mon ami. Ils vont sur voiture. Nous perdons le match. In these examples, I've used short sentences from ir, and re verbs, and they all stick perfectly to their conjugation patterns.